Thank you. That was a terrific first session, Judge. If I may implore the court to please forgive me for not wearing a necktie in your presence. I never do so, but I will make an exception for you, I promise. You know, the conversation there got me to wondering just for a minute, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand if you have been personally affected by substance abuse, addiction, alcoholism, family member, friend, yourself, period. Right.
Oh, wow.
I think it illustrates, one, that, you know, we're all in this together, and two, the folks aren't alone. And so people like Ms. Carney and Mr. White, who came to share their stories today, takes an awful lot of courage, and we appreciate that because it's deeply insightful. I mean, I've personally been affected by drug addiction on numerous levels, close family, close friends, and it's a devious thing to deal with. It's very difficult. So thank you for sharing that. We appreciate that very much. Let me introduce our guest here. Of course, you've already met Judge Hendricks on the stage with us. We also have with us the Honorable Judge Chuck Simmons, who is here in Greenville and has a deep history with drug courts and drug interdiction. So, Mr. Simmons, thank you for being here. We appreciate that very much. And we also have Mr. Brent Metcalf, who is with the U.S. Probation Office and has been a probation officer for many years, dealing with both criminal defendants and drug defendants as well. We're going to discuss the difference between those two. But Judge Simmons, if I could start with you, going back to your history in state court, we talked about the difference between federal court and state court in the drug interdiction process. When did this really start here in South Carolina? How did you become involved, and what were the prevailing reasons why that started?
The short answer is I was approached probably 18, 19 years ago, about 18 or 19 years ago, by the solicitor who said, I want to start a drug court. Would you be willing to preside over it? My knee-jerk reaction was, that's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. But then after I spent the night thinking, you know, as a judge, you're supposed to look at the evidence, look at the facts, look at the research. And then what I started thinking about with Judge Hendricks, as a judge who sentences someone, within 3 years, there's an almost 70% chance that that person is going to be back into the criminal justice system. And in the meantime, they're going to wreak a lot of havoc, cause a lot of problems. And so what started out to me is a social program. The more I looked at it, I realized something had to happen. Something had to be changed because what we were doing simply was not working. We continued to lock people up. We tried to legislate more, punish more. And then, probably about 20, 25 years ago, the tide started turning a little bit, and the early research started showing you can't punish your way out of addiction. And so that's what first got my attention, and I've been on the drug court bench for 18 years now.
Is that a difficult mindset to come to with some people in your profession? Because the mode was for so long to simply, well, we'll lock our way out of this problem.
Oh, absolutely. And it took a while for my mindset to change, because a judge typically is supposed to be impartial, uninvolved, impose a sentence and move on. But with drug courts and now veterans treatment courts that we'll talk about in just a few minutes, it is a much different role, because you are a judge, you are a counselor, you're a grandparent, you're an encourager, you're a disciplinarian, and it is a myriad of roles that come together with the help of a wonderful team that gets crazy good results.
Mr. Metcalf, your experience with this program, as you look at, say, I don't want to use the word routine criminals, but people who are out to do bad, as opposed to people who commit crimes because they generally have an issue with substance abuse or addiction. Have you always held the view that the two should be treated differently, or is this something you have arrived at later on in your professional career?
You know, as a traditional probation officer, we supervise by individuals by their risk. We'll take a look at the defendant's instability factors. We'll look at the special conditions that have been supervised or that have been ordered by the court, and we'll supervise those individuals or those those conditions of supervision or those supervision standards based on the risk. Then we'll take a look at drug court defendants or participants, and those individuals, they have a specific requirement that they have to complete, and typically it's in a phase system. So to get within a graduated system, they have to complete phase 1, then we'll have a graduation, or there'll be some positive reinforcement that will be given, then they'll move up to phase 2, and then eventually graduate to the program. Drug court participants, when they walk into the drug court programs, typically they do not have structure, they're dysfunctional, and what we are asking them to do is tremendous. They have to go to substance abuse meetings each week. They're having contact with me as a probation officer with my traditional probation offenders. I may see them once a month, every other month, but with these folks, typically they're seeing me once or twice a week. In addition to that, we have judges who, if there's non-compliant issues, that they're being addressed immediately, or if they're doing well, that positive reinforcement that's brought in.
What is your particular role day to day when you're dealing with people who are in the Bridge program or drug offenders who want to work their way out?
With my drug court folks, I'm answering telephone calls from them, texts from them, drug test, going to visit them at treatment sessions, being engaged in that treatment. That's a very important part of the process also. I'm just not referring these folks out to substance abuse treatment. I am part of the treatment process. I'm engaged in their treatment. I know what's going on daily with these folks. If there's an issue that's going on in their home life, if there's an issue that's going on at work, we're processing that information immediately.
It's as if you were an adjunct counselor, in a sense, per se.
Yes, in drug court, it's a very intense program. It's supervision on steroids. We are there. We are overseeing these folks when they're doing well and when they're not doing well, trying to bring them into compliance. And with drug courts, we also understand that relapse is going to happen. So it's the strong arm of the criminal justice system that's also playing the part of rehabilitation, that we understand that when that relapse occurs, that we're going to deal with it, but we can continue to move forward.
How big of a component do you think, we heard the word hope used quite often, and we've heard it used many times during the course of the first 2 weeks of this summer series, but how important of a component is that in somebody's overall rehabilitation?
I think it's a very important component because these folks, when they're coming into the program, typically they're coming in, their lives are dysfunctional at home, there's no structure, so we're giving them that structure. Once again, it's a very complex, structured environment that they're having to participate in. And hopefully, as William talked about earlier, hopefully they're building that foundation that when they're no longer under the arm of the criminal justice system, that they know how to utilize those tools, that they know how to utilize, if they're having those cravings or their triggers, whatever's going on, that they know how to utilize that foundation.
Judge Hendricks, last week when we spoke with representatives from Probation, Partner in Parole, and Department of Corrections, both agencies spoke of forming these community partnerships and developing these public-private relationships to try and help come together as a community to solve some of these very complex problems. You have also turned to the community as well to say, this is all of our problem. What specifically can you and you and you do to help? How much time do you spend trying to build those relationships and foster those relationships and convince people that this is something worth doing?
Well, it's become part of my daily life. I can't walk into a grocery store without looking to see if they might need, one of our folks to work. Walking up and down the street. I didn't know anything about drug courts when I was asked to help start one 5 years ago. But the first place I went was across the street to visit Judge Simmons's drug court and Judge Irv Condon's down in Charleston. And since that time, I have seen the amazing results that can happen in drug court and Judge Simmons's court and Judge Condon's court. So I tend to be kind of enthusiastic about things, and so wherever I go, I am now a disciple of the benefits of these type programs that are well researched as well. But we've had Whole Foods hire our folks. We've had Whole Foods come and present nutrition programs, exercise programs. We've gotten involved with the Federal Bar Association and partnered with them, and they've produced a wonderful mentor program where lawyers in the community who aren't necessarily criminal lawyers but practice civil law have come in and partnered and mentored our participants, because as you might have learned through tonight, that our participants, their lives are generally in disarray when they start the program, thanks, unfortunately, to their addiction. So they have all kind of problems. They have problems with their landlords. They have criminal records that are keeping them from getting jobs. They have DUSs and don't have driver's license. That's driving under suspension. A lot of that. They've lost their driver's licenses, or they need to go back to school and get their GEDs. And these lawyers in the community with the federal bar have really created a wonderful support system. We also partner with South Carolina Vocational Rehabilitation. They send a representative to our team, and they help our folks get trained for jobs, because we do require, as we've said, they've got to be working, or they've got to be in school, or I'm going to have them doing community service. So they get motivated.
Well, it's about that accountability. When you have a job, you are accountable to someone other than yourself, in addition to the drug court. And I would imagine there's that sense that maybe after tripping for a while and not going in the general direction, I'm accomplishing something. Is there some of that?
There definitely is, and you can see the pride in the participants as they accomplish each step, and the pride in the team watching them complete the step, and it really is a growing experience for all involved. Very rewarding.
Judge Simmons, you brought up the Veterans Court that you've established here in Greenville. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between what you call a Veterans Court and the traditional drug court?
Veterans Court, in a very real way, is an outgrowth of the
success of drug courts, because the research and the evidence behind drug courts is so phenomenal to show the success rate and how it saves tax dollars and saves lives. And so what the country began to notice, in addition to needing a new microphone, all right. Just some research for two reasons. Number one, because I took the time to look it up, and number two, because you need to hear this. Thus far, in Iraq and Afghanistan, over 2.5 million of our finest young men and finest young women have served, and they've been put into hellish situations. They're told to go over there, serve, protect, and when necessary to kill. They're not sure who the enemy is. Right, two of them choke up. They're told, we don't know who the enemy is, we don't know what the enemy looks like, but you go in and you kick doors and you look for the bad guys. And you look out for IEDs, and you look out for landmines. 60% of the deaths over in Iraq and Afghanistan for our troops have been because of IEDs and landmines. And so then one day, our finest come back. They're given a piece of paper and they're told, thanks for your service is over. Most come back and they're strengthened by what they've done for our great country. But let me read you some statistics. More than 260,000 veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan have been diagnosed with traumatic brain injuries. 1 in 5 veterans has symptoms of mental disorders or cognitive impairment. 20% who are coming back. 1 in 6 who's been deployed comes back with substance abuse issues. Post-traumatic stress disorder affects 14% of veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, 30% from the Vietnam Wars. And over 50% when they come back, they don't seek treatment because they've been taught, you stand tall, you fight, you don't need help. And they try to self-medicate, to try to run away from the horrors, to try to run away from the nightmares, and they get into the criminal justice system. And so drug courts have been so successful. Veterans Court started in 2008. And here's the deal with that. It's not something that's nice to do. It is something that's being done because our country has an obligation to our men and women. When they come back, they fought for us, and now it's our turn to fight for them. And so that's how Veterans Court uses a drug court model. And good news on that front. I was in Washington last week for some congressional hearings dealing with Veterans Court, veterans issues. The tide is changing on the state level and on the federal level because of drug courts, because of visionaries like Judge Hendricks, who says, let's step outside of what we've always done and let's do something different because the research and the science supports it. And so what my sense is, just think what I would do if the microphone was working, okay? My sense is, here's what's going to come out of Washington now. If you're dangerous and if we're scared of you, we will lock you up because you need to be in prison. If probation will help you, if you've made a bad mistake, 2 bad mistakes, if probation will help you, we're going to do that for you. But when you come back with traumatic injuries, when you come back with addiction issues, when you come back with post-traumatic stress, we're going to find a place and we're going to help you because that's our responsibility. So that's kind of a weaving answer to your question. The Veterans Treatment Court deals with veterans who are coming back, who have been ignored and who have hidden for so many years under bridges or in bushes, literally. And the Veterans Treatment Court says, we're going to reach out and help you, and we're going to show you how to get your life back.
Who do we rely on to refer these veterans to this particular court? Who can we trust to identify these folks and say, wait, hold on, there's something more to this issue than somebody loitered in a bad place or property damage?
In the upstate in Greenville, we have remarkably wonderful law enforcement. And our officers are trained, and part of the intake interview is, have you served in the armed forces? There's a questionnaire at the detention center. Have you served in the armed forces? If so, then you get put on a different track to where if that is something that can be beneficial, thanks to our law enforcement, thanks to our system, they have a place to go now.
Mr. Metcalf, when you're doing the role playing here in the court session there, referring to a bump in the road, for people who suffer from addiction, people who have been hooked on drugs, there can be any number of triggers throughout the course of just a single day. Walking by a particular street corner, seeing a particular group of friends, maybe hearing type of music, you name it. I'm sure you've heard just about every story imaginable, but the challenges that these folks face upon trying to rehabilitate and re-enter and live lives that are clean, talk about that a little bit if you would, because it's not an easy thing to do.
I want to give an example of a couple of years ago when I was working for the state drug court program over in Spartanburg. I was doing a home visit on an individual, individual in phase 1. We're having a interaction with him, his grandmother, and myself. The TV was on in the background. The participant, he started sweating, and I visually started noticing this, and I stopped my conversation and I asked him what was going on. At that point in time, he was having a craving. He was watching, there was a movie that was on, there was a drug transaction that occurred, and his drug of choice was cocaine, and he was actually having a craving right there, having a conversation with a probation officer. So these struggles, as William indicated, they're always going to be there. We don't have a magic wand for addiction, but what we can do is lay a very strong foundation while they're part of the criminal justice system, and that foundation to give them the structure where they can take that foundation once they graduate the program and to live productive, successful lives.
How gratifying must it be to see, with some folks, I would imagine maybe the switch goes on, the light goes on, and although you don't overcome it, you're not cured by it, but you begin to realize that maybe there's a chance I can control this.
Sure, and you watch that transformation. You watch an individual that walks into a program the first day of drug court, and he or she, the structure's not there, their appearance, it's bad, it's poor, and you watch that individual grow, and you watch them go through the different phases and the different hurdles to maintain employment, clean drug test, completing financial literacy classes, whatever program requirement that they're completing, but at the end you see a productive, employable member of society that has gone through a remarkable change.
Beats the alternative of being behind bars.
Sure.
Judge Hendricks, President Obama recently shone a spotlight on the federal prison system here, visited a federal prison. I believe in Oklahoma, went to a solitary confinement cell, but really was bringing up the issue of our prisons at the federal level, becoming unsustainable in a sense, as you mentioned in your their attention towards the bridge program here and the attention that Attorney General Holder is giving you. Talk a little bit about what that has been like as they sort of looked and peeked around the corner and said, what's going on down there in South Carolina?
Well, it was very surprising and rewarding, and took a great deal of preparation logistically, which was interesting. Our courthouse turned into an armed fortress to get ready for his visit. It's akin to the participants supporting each other in their recovery to have the leadership in Attorney General Holder, the Department of Justice, and other courts even to give us support, to keep us going in our efforts to work with the participants. It's a great joy to work with them, but it can get emotionally draining for the team itself to keep working. Sometimes we run into horrific problems that people have in their home lives, no roof over their head. We're struggling literally to get them a bed to sleep in and keep them off of the drugs at the same time. And so to have the honor of the White House show an interest in our program just rejuvenates you and makes you want to dig in even more. And to have them come and see Mr. William White in our courtroom, and Mr. Holder was there for the graduation of one of our participants, was rewarding for all, and just really just keeps us going.
Do you think that this serves as a model for a national program? Is there talk among federal attorneys that we could see this implemented across the country in every state of the nation, so every federal potential inmate has an opportunity to enter a program like this?
Yeah, there is a conversation now nationally. The Criminal Law Committee of the United States, which is a committee of federal judges, and I think it's about 12 judges. They are appointed by Chief Justice John Roberts to serve on this very important committee that really sets policy for the whole country, for the United States Probation Office, and for the courts. The committee came and visited the bridge program last December, and they were very enthusiastic. They got to meet Mr. William White, Ms. Carney, and about 8 or 9 other graduates, and they were very impressed and moved. And since then, many of their prosecutors from their districts have come back and studied our program so that they could then go back and implement ones in their own states.
Judge Simmons, it seems like this is so commonsensical that very few would have objections to the use of drug courts. But are there objectors out there? And if so, what would be their reasons?
Well, common sense doesn't always drive our country.
We would have no sort of serious
because if you sit down with someone, if a judge puts somebody in prison here in South Carolina, and at any one time there are 22,000 inmates at SCDC, then right off the bat in South Carolina, it's costing me and you $18,000 a year. Drug court, about $2,500 a year, most of which are paid on the state level by the participants. And at the same time, these people are in court several times a week, they're in counseling several times a week, they're random drug tests, they're unannounced home visits for 18 months. And if they choose not to get their life back, they go to the Department of Corrections and do an active prison sentence. They had the chance, they blew it, their choice. But for those who graduate, and I think Judge Hendricks made this observation, 75% who finish drug court never see another pair of handcuffs. The recidivism rate is flipped upside down. Don't go through drug court or some type of alternative court situation. There's a 70% chance within 3 to 4 years you can be back in the criminal justice system, and you're going to cost us a whole lot more money. Do a drug court program. We're going to save monies, we're going to save lives, we're going to reunite families, we're going to get you employed, we're going to teach you a value system, and we're going to keep people like me and you much safer. So that's why, and I mentioned earlier, up on Capitol Hill, criminal justice reform, Democrats are agreeing to it, Republicans are agreeing to it. I think they're going to coalesce around some substantial changes. And again, because of what Judge Hendricks has done on the federal level, she's gotten the attention, and other district court judges who are willing to go outside the box. State level, there are over 3,000 state drug courts. So the research, the data says it works. Let's do it.
Would there be folks at the federal level, Judge Hendricks, who might have objections to expansion of programs like this?
Sure. And
is it mostly over politics or money?
I think it's over money, and I think it's also over a concern that judges, maybe it's not their responsibility to become involved as closely as we do with personal issues with offenders that are in front of us. Whether or not we should get our hands dirty and roll up our sleeves, and whether or not we should become that involved with the folks who appear in front of us. Whether that's so non-traditional that we shouldn't do that. But I don't think that we have a choice anymore in this country to do that. I think that we have to roll up our sleeves and get involved and try to repair these people's lives so that they can become taxpayers and they can, their families can be reunited, and give them a chance and give them some hope, because after all, they're Americans as well.
Well, it's very different than what was set up in the last, say, 25 years. Federal sentencing guidelines, mandatory minimums, phrases like 3 strikes and you're out, where literally many people like yourself sitting there, perhaps hearing stories that you could empathize with or say that person could be saved, and yet it appears as if you had no leeway in many situations. Was that the case, that many federal judges were up against that wall to a degree?
That was the case, and it still is the case to a large extent. But creativity and looking outside our federal courts and looking to the state courts has taught us to become more creative, and that we can. There's great possibilities.
Wisdom from the bench.
Yeah, and we were supervising these people one way or another anyway. The folks were coming out of prison, as Mr. White was. He served a sentence. He was charged with a crime, and he served a sentence, and he came out on what's called supervised release, which is like probation or parole, if you understand it, but you've got to be under the supervision of somebody like Mr. Metcalf for anywhere from 1 to 5 years. And so they were already providing drug treatment and services and vocational rehabilitation opportunities to people like Mr. White. So what we did, though, is just to bring a judge into the system so that Mr. White and people like him would have to show up in front of a judge once every couple of weeks. And that changes and it marshals the assets that probation has been applying to these people. When Mr. Metcalf in the past would tell Mr. White, you can't use drugs and you've got to get a job, Mr. White might not listen as carefully, but when Mr. White knows he's got to come see me and I've got that robe on and I might throw him in jail if he doesn't do those things, it makes a difference. So plugging in the judge into what the traditional supervision methods have been has that alone is something all federal judges could do today.
Yet another level of accountability.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, Mr. Metcalf, the difference there between pre-sentence and re-entry programs, Judge Hendricks touched on it briefly there, but the difference between those two and your role in both of them.
Typically, when you start looking at the pre-sentence process, you start looking at, in the federal world, pretrial diversion, and in the state system, a pretrial intervention, a PTI program. Typically, those are for very low-risk offenders. Typically, they may have a small amount of community service to do. They may have restitution that they have to pay. Typically, there may be an educational substance abuse treatment requirement that's there, but it's not what our drug court folks have to participate in. Typically, these educational programs, 6 to 8 weeks. When you start looking at a substance abuse treatment program for drug court folks, you're starting to look at anywhere on the spectrum from inpatient treatment to folks that are coming in phase 1 that they may have 2 or 3 group sessions or individual sessions per week that they're having to participate in. So there is a difference there between those diversion programs and drug court. When you start looking at the reentry process, statistically what we know is that 95% of our prison population at some point in time is going to be released to the community. So reentry has to start the day that the offender is assessed in the Department of Corrections or in the federal system in the BOP. Case managers start working with those individuals to produce, such as Social Security cards, driver's license, those basic fundamental foundations that they will have to have when released to be successful back out in the community.
I think most of you remember last week when Mr. Andrews came up and gave the presentation about the litigation against Department of Corrections and its treatment of the mentally ill. And he spoke about just how few doctors were available, psychiatric doctors available to treat mentally ill patients here in South Carolina. So let me just ask you this question about resources. We know how intensive a process this can be. Is it ever a struggle to find qualified counselors for some of the folks going through the Bridge program? Ever a worry of yours? Do we have enough of that help to help these folks?
The federal system, we have contract providers that we reach out to through the bidding process. We also utilize state agencies such as the Department of Mental Health. South Carolina Vocational Rehabilitation serves as an awesome resource that can provide inpatient treatment, but also employment opportunities, training for our offender population. But the one thing that we're always looking for, we're always looking for mentors to help our drug court participants, to assist them with coming up with filling out a job application or how to do a mock interview during an employment process. Those are things that mentors or coaches can help assist with.
We've got a lot of folks in the audience here who have that ability, I know, and always expressed an interest about what can I do when I leave here. That's certainly one of those suggestions you might take home with you. Judge Simmons, if I could ask you about the relationship between state and federal courts, and if there is an area here that maybe you can come together, work together more effectively on this topic, or are you doing so already?
Well, the state and the federal judicial system are totally different. If you have federal crimes and charges, you go to federal court. If you have state crimes and charges, you come to state court. What I have personally enjoyed so much about my friendship with Judge Hendricks is there's such a camaraderie and such a team effort. She could care less that I'm state court. I could care less. Okay, not quite as much. But the ability for us to call each other and to say, hey, here's what I'm dealing with. We're both involved with a group called the National Association of Drug Court Professionals, NADCP, out of Washington, where I've had the great pleasure of being on the board for years. And that is a clearinghouse of research and data. And Judge Hendricks is well known and well respected up there. So is there anything formally going on? Not that I know of. But have Judge Hendricks and I been able to work together and develop a good working relationship? Absolutely, because I think that's the heart and the passion of a drug court judge, is to say, it's not working, let's come together and make a difference.
What do you think, Judge Hendricks? Are there opportunities that maybe have not been identified yet, or identified but not yet acted upon?
Absolutely. I have ideas every day about what we can do to collaborate with Judge Simmons and how we could share resources. I really wish that somebody would create a blue ribbon commission up in Washington so we can find out how we can all work together, because Judge Simmons' court, and I don't know if your court in particular, but the state courts seem to get the benefit of federal grant money. And for the federal court, for some reason, which you say you like, we don't seem to be able to get those grants, and it seems like it would be nice if we could actually collaborate in regards to that as well. I have a dream. And the dream is that we can all work together hand in hand to help these folks and help them become great citizens. But also there's a tremendous need for like I mentioned earlier, a lot of these folks literally don't have roofs over their heads. They've burned all their bridges at home. Their family relations are tanked. They're hostile situations, and we need just to get them safe, to get them in a safe place off the street, and in a place that supports recovery. And there's a great need for that, and I really would like to see the state and federal courts work together to create a halfway house, or what they call a sober house, a recovery house, and one that Chet's court could use and one that my court could use, and run by retired federal probation officers. Don't retire on me yet.
Well, Mr. Metcalf, we talk about the family, burning bridges. Anybody that's been around somebody who's abused substances or has been addicted to drugs knows that it's a very frustrating experience, that you can easily give up on these people and say, look, I don't know how many chances I've given you, but it's enough, I'm done. On that role of reiterating and getting close to being successful through a bridge program or drug court, are you able to look at some of those family members and say, I know you've been burned before, I know you don't fully trust him or her, but you can come down here and see this for yourself?
Sure. It's the family members, they're frustrated. You know, they've dealt with this for years. You know, they've had experiences of where not only the addiction, but the underlying issues where they may have had their possessions stolen by the participant in years past. I think latest statistics showed that when folks are, when they exit incarceration facilities, that only about a third of the prison population actually has a family member there waiting on them. So that family environment is very strained. So it takes a very, it's a very important part of the process, but it does take a long time to see those participants and those family members to reunite. It may be situations of husband, wives, it may be siblings, it may be children with a parent and a child that we have to go through the reunification process with. But one of the great things about this program is to see that relationship regain strength. And that is part of the program, and those are one of the things that we take on.
Well, for both judges here, the role that medical or clinical science might play in some of your decision-making, some of your judgments from the bench about people, has that changed at all, the introduction of modern science? And I was growing up, people just assumed folks were addicted because they chose to be. You know, they wanted to be drunks because that's the way they were. Much of our thinking has changed and come a long way since then. But how much of an actual role will that play in a court? Science.
Judge Simmons, what's your?
Yeah, we've moved beyond my opinions and my thoughts to what does the science show, what does the research show, and let's have evidence-based practices, which is what Judge Hendricks uses, which is what I use, because otherwise you have this hodgepodge of inconsistencies, but we're both following medicine and following science, and also trying to put the compassion into a rehabilitative environment with teeth.
Judge Hendricks, I'm curious why you're so passionate about this particular subject. When you began on this road in your career, started your law work, did you ever dream that this is eventually was going to be your crusade of sorts?
No, never dreamed of it. I had, as I mentioned, I'd been a prosecutor for years. I'd seen some really sad stories, some cases where 20, 30 people were charged and indicted, and many of them were really, it was more of a social problem and a medical problem and a health problem than a criminal problem. They were selling drugs or doing their crimes because they were physically addicted. And to see people that are physically addicted and out of control of their lives is just is really a sad state. So I often, wanted to figure out a way to help, and this really has been a blessing for me, and I hope we've been able to make a difference as well.
What about you, Judge?
I think drug court has been one of the most rewarding, yet also one of the most frustrating when you see lives that crash and burn. But at the end of the day, what an amazing opportunity the Lord has laid in front of you to make a difference in somebody's life, and that's the motivation.
Mr. Metcalf, we had a question from the audience, concerned about how do you keep your children away from the path. We know addiction can be very clever, it can be very tricky, that anyone can be susceptible, but I think there's probably some common concurrent themes among many of the people that you deal with directly. Can you talk about some of those that you see, some of those common threads and things that maybe we should all be on the lookout for?
I think that the one thing that we need to make sure that we do is we talk to our children. Addiction comes from, participants have various socioeconomic backgrounds. I mean, it's not that there's any true foundation that's there, but know who your kids are talking to, know who your kids are hanging out with. As you have mentioned, go through their book bags. Talk to your children. I mean, we have to, as parents, we have to be parents. We have to have that structure. We have to have those communications with our children. We have to have those communications with our educators and within our school system, our teachers. It has to be a collaborative effort. If it's not a collaborative effort, we're going to miss something.
Judge Hendricks, Judge Simmons, Mr. Metcalf, thank you all three for joining us here tonight, and our previous guest who spoke, very powerful, very insightful. We appreciate that as well.